think we're going to get started, and if more people trickle in, that's fine, but we don't want to start too late and run out of time. So I'm going to begin by just introducing our panelists, and this is the Violence Across Borders panel, and I see we have some international partners in the audience, so you're in the right place. I'm excited about that. So just to my left is Jeremy Biddle, who's the founding executive director of MetroPEACE and previous coordinator for Central American Regional Security Initiatives at USAID. Under Jeremy's leadership, various violence reduction strategies, including multiple approaches highlighted at this conference, were implemented across Latin America and the Caribbean. To his left is Burt, who works on an application of focused deterrence in Minneapolis as the multi-strategy project coordinator for the Minneapolis Police Department. He's also the supervisor for their community Navigator unit, and that incorporates cultural and issue-specific lenses, and with the support of the MPD's Procedural Justice Unit, addresses gaps in the department's service delivery that present barriers to building trust. Rory Gagan is the head of criminal justice at the Center for Social Justice in the UK. And he's a former police officer with Scotland Yard, working on community policing and gangs task force. He has himself been the victim of gun violence, and as a part of his work at the CSJ, has been involved in advocating for focused deterrence and group violence interventions in London and the UK. Isael González Goodman is the director of Ranchero, Pandillero, part of the Center for Adolescents of San Miguel de Allende in Mexico, and his work is currently focused on a street outreach model of violence reduction. Isael was also an advisor at NNSC previously, so he is very familiar with our work. And then last but certainly not least is Rachel Locke. She is currently the head of research, Grand Challenge on 16.1, Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies at the Center on International Cooperation at New York University. And Rachel founded the international portfolio at the National Network, so she's intimately familiar with our work, and she's also worked previously for USAID on issues of civil war and conflict-type violence. So we have a stellar panel here with us, and I'm going to start by framing up a little bit how this panel connects to the rest of the conference, and then opening it up to our panelists to share with you all some of their thoughts. So this entire conference centers on the fact that the actual nature of communities and conflicts are different from how they were previously construed. And based on what we now know about the nature of communities and conflicts, a small set of proved effective violence prevention interventions has been developed, which is what we've been talking about through the whole first day and this morning. What we know about serious violence is driven by a small number of high-risk people, and those at high risk are often acting in groups and networks. And actually, one thing that Eric Humberbatch said yesterday is it's not high-risk people, it's people that are exposed to multiple risk factors, and I really liked that framing, so we'll try to stick with that. So everything that's known to work is built on identifying and then engaging with those groups. And it's important to acknowledge that this population has been exposed to high levels of violence and trauma. So effectively engaging with those individuals can involve different interventions, like we've been talking about here, and successful evidence-based approaches to reduce violence hinges on direct communication with those groups and networks, and offering information about risk, opportunities for protection, support, community norms, and legal environments. So previous public discourse and national and international policy arenas, community and justice systems have received attention and condemnation as needing to be fixed, which is really corrosive and condescending. So we know that dangerous communities are not dangerous or deviant, and they're remarkably ordinary places with a small number of extremely high-risk people in them. And regarding justice systems, evidence suggests that small-scale efforts can demonstrate a really positive impact even within systems that are in need of substantial reform, so that micro efforts can meaningfully reduce violence within these larger systems. So complete system reform is not required in order to make progress. We can and should reset our understanding and representations as such, stop treating whole communities as lost or at risk, and focus on violence as the critically important but very much smaller issue that it actually is. So this is essentially what David's been said in his introduction and what you all have been hearing about at the conference over the past day and a half now. So just to introduce myself, I've worked at the National Network for almost 2 years. I'm duly appointed on our national and our international teams. And so I'm uniquely situated to evaluate the ways in which the facts on the ground are similar and talk to some of the innovative ways that we've considered adapting our core principles to design effective violence reduction strategies, be it in El Salvador, Mexico, Sweden. And I can speak to these scenarios in the question and answer period if they come up. And so I'm going to start by asking one broad question to the group, let everybody answer that, and then we'll get into some more specifics. So that big question I have for the group is, I want to give you each a few minutes to explain the extent to which the facts and frameworks I've outlined and that David outlined yesterday connect to your work.
Thank you. So again, my name is Jeremy Biddle. I am a recovering bureaucrat that's finally had the muzzle taken off, so I've been able to embrace my activist side as well. The work that, I don't focus primarily on the work that I did internationally. Right now I'm doing work in Baltimore, and I have a lot to say about that, but I think in terms of cross borders, in terms of this idea of violence not knowing borders, but the solutions too often, unfortunately, being stuck at borders. A lot of the work that remains to be done is finding these promising practices, where this evidence exists, and seeing what room there is for creative experimentation in other contexts. So this whole idea of adaptability and viability, and it's a really wonky, somewhat kind of inward-looking conversation that happens from a very academic perspective. And I will definitely focus some remarks afterwards on a broader perspective, but that was really what had driven a lot of the work that I'd done at USAID. Building not only a portfolio that allows for that experimental adaptation, but even building a language within the organization and the institution that prioritizes issues of violence. You can't talk about Latin America and the Caribbean. You can't talk about this hemisphere without talking about certain issues of violence. And that certainly extends to all forms of violence, but most notably gun violence, which is something I would like to speak to in a bit. But there's just, again, my point being, as an intro, a lot to be learned throughout this hemisphere.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Burt, and in my work, in speaking to this and the overall theme, a lot of the on-the-ground work, and I do a lot of community outreach. I have for the last 23 years with many of our new and emerging communities, is what we saw as the violence was concentrated within community, intra-community violence, and working to create a better cultural understanding within the police department and therefore the city to help us understand what the issues are, and also trying to develop programs and processes that allow us to offer, and I do believe policing is, it is the practice of extreme customer service, and understanding that we offer a service to community that is culturally competent, that is trauma-informed, and most importantly, the right service for the right folks. And sometimes that's a victim, sometimes that's a suspect who is operating out of lack of knowledge, and making sure that we're not harming a community in our practice of offering service. I guess for us and some of our conversations that we've had, it's about gaining that greater understanding and understanding that these are our colleagues, our neighbors, our friends. What are we doing to help them, keep them safe? Keep a community safe. There's always going to be bad actors, and we need to be surgical, we need to be precise, and we need to offer the proper service. With my group, the Community Navigators, I have a small cadre of folks who are very well versed in social service and resource finding to be able to offer something to community, and whether that's victim, suspect, or someone who's returning home from prison or jail, to be able to offer something to create an intervention point. And those intervention points are really important because if we do that enough, we reduce the violence within that community, which means we reduce violence in the greater community, and we also help change impressions of a people. So that was sort of where our focus is and what we've been building upon, and we've seen successes in it. It's, as anyone knows, it's hard within a frame of government to start something new. Everyone asks for evidence before they actually execute the idea. But we've been able to do that based upon a premise and really see very quick gains and very greater understanding and acceptance to try to grow and do it across a lot of different avenues and communities.
Good morning. I'm Rory Gagan from the Centre for Social Justice. We're based in London. We're a non-profit working to tackle poverty, and we have sort of 5 or 6 different units. One of them is obviously the Criminal Justice Unit, which is where our focus on violence at the moment sits. Previously, as mentioned, a police officer in London, and I suppose one of the reasons I left policing and moved into the non-profit space was sort of coming back to kind of the theme that David and others have spoken about yesterday and today, is around this issue of it being a relatively small number of people. And seeing, at least in London, seeing some of the criminal justice mechanisms kind of maybe sometimes picking up the right people, but not doing an awful lot to actually curb their offending or change their behaviours or change those underlying drivers. And so I was delighted to join the Centre for Social Justice and to revisit an issue of group violence, gang violence, as it's still sort of often referred to in the UK, and to basically look for, well, what works out there. And we were delighted, obviously, to come across the work of the National Network, who I'd like to thank for sort of having us over this week. But we came across that group violence intervention, and obviously as part of that, we then looked at, well, where has it worked? We then looked at where it's actually been tried before in the UK. So a city of Glasgow up in Scotland had sort of experimented, if you will, with the group violence intervention back in the sort of late 2000s, with good success, with good effect. Sadly, not necessarily as sustained as we'd like, and I think that's something that many others will speak to. And then obviously as well, we've been delighted to see some of our Swedish neighbours in Europe picking up the baton of group violence intervention. And so we're now sort of revisiting this again in London to try and push this again, to try and actually get this adopted. Very happy to talk about how some of the challenges exist for us and how we hope to overcome them. But certainly we also noticed that outside of London, we've got smaller jurisdictions who, because there's less sort of big P political, but also maybe sometimes less small P political issues going on, they're able to actually make some decent progress. So we're in a bit of a challenging spot where actually some of the areas that need it most in the UK are finding it hardest to both accept the language of it, accept the detail of it, and then obviously implement it. So look forward to discussing this further.
Good afternoon, or good morning. So yeah, as Adrienne mentioned, my name is Isael, and I used to work at the National Network. So when I moved back home to Mexico, I definitely started all this work with the framework of the National Network. And I think the most important part is that she mentioned that it's a small group of people involved with the majority of the violence. And that's exactly what we're seeing in Mexico, and I'm pretty sure that's what we see all across the world. And so in terms of doing our work, it's really a matter of how to engage with that population, how to communicate with that population. And that's like the principal focus of our work. We do street outreach work, so we don't exactly do the group violence intervention, because the group violence intervention also requires a big partnership with stakeholders from law enforcement, from community, from social services. And Mexico's not there yet. I mean, the conversations that Mexico's having are way behind what we're having here in the U.S. I mean, here people are talking about trauma-informed care. In Mexico, you never hear that. Here people are talking about how to engage with these populations that have been traditionally abused. Mexico is not talking about that. So when I try to, get closer to the local police department, they don't have the same kind of ears that they're having here. And when I try to talk to the mayor's office, they're like, oh, that's very nice work, and they're like, goodbye. So it's difficult, and that's, I think, partly why our work focuses more on street and gang outreach, because within the community, we can have these conversations. The community usually is a bit more open because, sadly, the community is more desperate for change.
My name's Rachel Locke again. I want to talk about concentration for a minute, and I want to sort of complicate what we're talking about for a second when we talk about concentration. So I started my career post-graduate school working in a part of East Africa in Uganda, in the north of Uganda, where there was 87 to 90% of the population displaced. So forced from their home and forced to live in internal displacement camps, which were the most wretched camps I've ever seen, and I've been to a lot of refugee camps. This displacement was enforced by the government, but it was caused by a group of between 200 and 500 individuals who were not particularly well organized, who in large part were made up of abducted children who had been conscripted, who had been forced to fight, who had suffered significant, huge, shocking amounts of trauma and abuse, including having to kill loved ones and family members. That is an extreme example of concentration. And this displacement and the reaction by the government and the international community to this 500 or less individuals that was causing this entire regional displacement was huge. But it was 500 people, right? So when you think about concentration, we can go from Minneapolis or Mexico City to northern Uganda and think about what concentration means and how the reaction to a very small targeted number of people is often way more complicated than it should be. At the same time, I want to remind us that 1/3 of all women globally face physical, sexual, and emotional abuse every year, every day. That 1 billion children in the world face abuse annually, right? That 5 billion people in the world, the majority of the world's people, fall through what we call a justice gap, have no access to sources of justice to mediate disputes, whether that's within their community, with their government, or with somebody across the border. So the fact that you have these massive levels of lack of justice, violence within the home, violence at a very young age that causes trauma, that causes structural systems of cycles of abuse, means that actually there's a huge degree of resilience. It also means that concentration is not the only thing we need to be paying attention to, and we need to be nuanced and disciplined with ourselves and how we're talking about all of this. So I throw that out there at the beginning, and then when you come back to me, I'll explain my title, because I know it doesn't make any sense at all.
Keep that over there. We'll go with the second one. So thank you all. I'm going to ask more specific questions to kind of draw out a little bit of your experiences, and then you all should feel free to respond to each other as makes sense. So we don't have to just go through this order, but and we will have time for questions at the end for everyone else. So Jeremy, can you talk or speak to some of the strategic decisions being made across Latin America regarding public safety strategies, and then tie that to what you've seen locally in the U.S. in terms of facts on the ground, what's effective, and barriers to these effective strategies?
Sure. So first, to Rachel's point, and I really want to piggyback off of that a little bit, this idea of the kind of the micro to the macro and that interconnectivity. I think a lot of times in these conversations of looking at the transferability of knowledge, the adaptability of models. We get into this modelitis kind of mentality where we look about, we look at GVI, for example, and is there feasibility for GVI to be piloted in, X community in Tijuana? That's a very important conversation to have. But I really don't want to create a false impression and have us delude ourselves into thinking that we're really going to be able to see these kinds of things at scale without some massive changes. We are fighting an upwards losing battle against some massive forces. And that's why I just want to kind of look around the room and look at everyone in the conference and just say straight out, the fact that all of us are here together as a community is so important, because we are the total underdogs in this conversation, nationally and internationally. The people that understand public safety from this kind of perspective, more nuanced, understanding the public health component, understanding the importance of community and community voice, and understanding the damage done by these very harsh over-application of criminal justice. If you get it, if you're woke to that, then bravo. We really need to embrace each other a lot more. And I hope that we do. In the work in Latin America, and this really applies to what we're seeing nationally, we have a national conversation right now about the harms caused by policing. We do not have that conversation in a lot of other contexts. So we have to be very careful and deliberate about how we use this kind of work and how we apply it in other settings. In El Salvador, and Rachel and I go way back, full disclosure, back to our work at USAID, where we were, you were originally, Africa-focused conflict person, and I was the Latin America, violence guy, and we've crossed worlds in a lot of really interesting ways. When we're looking at some of these models, we really have to ask ourselves, are we going to cause more harm than good? And we have to think about this. In El Salvador, where we were first looking at feasibility, and I'll let you guys speak to the report. I'm no longer the USAID guy. I no longer wear that hat, so I won't hog that point. You really have to, take some time to seriously consider whether or not giving law enforcement certain information about individuals when the law enforcement is so undisciplined that they've been known to create extrajudicial killing squads and literally assassinate gang members or alleged gang members willy-nilly, and we don't even have real reliable statistics on that. You have to be careful about what kind of tools you're putting in what hands. And again, back to this issue of scale, right? Latin America, I'm not going to cite a lot of these. I don't know necessarily what you guys know about this, but we talk about hemispheric violence for a reason. About 47, and this changes yearly, 47 to 48 of the world's most violent cities in the world fall in this hemisphere. Baltimore happens to be one of them. We see striking numbers of gun deaths. 6 countries account for more than half of the annual total of gun homicides, or gun deaths actually, in the world. The United States, of course, majority is suicide, but even so, Guatemala, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and I don't know if I got the 6th there, but you'll give me a bly on that one. There are enormous amounts of stats that we can make, kind of use to allude to the point of how there is this violence dynamic that is not only hemispheric wide and concentrated in cities, and of course regressive in its impact towards minority communities, people living in conditions of poverty, et cetera. But kind of piggybacking off of that and looking at some of these challenges again that we would face in bringing things to scale, which is really the intersection point where we were always finding ourselves struggling in managing these big budgets and these expectations of Congress that we were going to throw money at something and homicide rates were going to come down. Really, we were deluding ourselves because we're battling a number of things. First is the lack of data that is intrinsic to the region. We talk about data challenges and underreporting in U.S. communities. We are talking about massive underreporting and lack of confidence in police in Latin American and Caribbean communities. Someone mentioned in a previous panel about how in those hyper-affected communities in the U.S., 30% of people reported trusting the police. That is a region-wide statistic that applies for Latin America. Lawrence Sherman, a criminologist, and I'll wonk out for a sec, famously, actually there was an IDB-funded report to this point, said that the lack of data in the region is not a challenge for an important problem. It is the most important problem in itself, because without this kind of reliable data, we don't even know what kind of enormity we're talking about. We don't even know, we know that there are close to 150,000 violent deaths a year in the region, but we can't really disaggregate at municipal levels, at sub-municipal levels, getting ideas of victimology and profiles. We can't really dig deeper, except for in these very highly targeted micro-pilot efforts where we might really pour enough resources in to be able to gather that kind of data. But again, it really raises serious questions about scalability. Another is, we talk about the endurance of tough-on-crime approaches domestically, and that they're alive and kicking here too, right? But in Latin America, 9 of 10 people, and this was from a 2012 UNDP survey, 9 of 10 people surveyed believed that repressive, punitive policies were the most effective form of crime control. It doesn't enjoy just government support, it enjoys public support. It is a major beast that needs to be contended with. So we can talk amongst ourselves about GVI, about cognitive behavioral therapy and trauma-focused and trauma-informed approaches, but we are always going to be those underdogs in that discussion. We have serious issues about scalability. Then, of course, there's weak institutions. I won't go too much into that, but having worked for years in Honduras, where patrol cars for cops often don't even have gas. You have police who can't even write police reports. You have a criminal justice chain that is broken in so many ways that you don't even know where to start. And these are the kinds of questions we were left scratching our heads about. Major challenge. And then finally, I'll just leave off with this because and I'll happy to answer more in questions. Guns. Why is Latin America's brand of violence so lethal? It wasn't always the case that gun-related homicides were dominant. It was really only in the past 10 years, for example, in the case of Mexico, where gun-related homicides overtook other forms or other vehicles of homicide. And even though the data are correlational, I don't want us to overlook it. When you look at U.S. exports of arms to the region and how they have skyrocketed, and I know I'm sure I'm in good company when I'm kind of bad-talking the Trump administration, but it didn't just start under the Trump administration. It's gotten worse under the Trump administration. Now there's no longer soon no longer going to be Department of State oversight over legal arms sales to the region. It's going to now small arms are considered consumable goods and are going to be overseen by the Commerce Department, which has, frankly, zero incentive to provide any kind of record of arms sales. And that's just legal arms sales. What about illegal straw purchases? We see all of these U.S. assault rifles that end up in the hands of drug cartels, completely overpowering local police forces. I mean, I can go on and on and on. 70% of guns recovered at crime scenes in Mexico can be traced back to the U.S., and we don't even have information sharing agreements internally from different states. I mean, the ATF and their gun trace basically doesn't. Anyway, I can go on and on and on. I won't go on anymore. I think I said enough. The tie to Baltimore, I mean, really, Baltimore, I felt a calling to go there. I'm in this work for the long run. I not only needed a vacation from Trump land, but I saw a city very close to where I live in Washington, D.C., that is suffering. And I wanted to join that fight with my comrades in arms there. And there's amazing work being done. But there are amazing and major challenges there as well. Of course, in this kind of building this police community divide, in fighting against the cynicism of just being a city that has unfortunately had very few success stories to tell in recent years. I'll leave it there.
So there was a lot in that, Jeremy. I want to pick up on some of those threads. First, you made the opening for me to just mention the work that we did in El Salvador, which was essentially a feasibility study looking at could some kind of focused deterrence work promote a positive change anywhere within El Salvador. And so I was part of a team that did field research there and co-wrote a USAID report that came out about that. So plugging for that for anyone that wants to check that out. But what we ended up finding was that we did think that there could be some positive impact of bringing together the kind of three-legged stool that we talk about here at the National Network of community moral voice with community service support and outreach providers and with law enforcement. And what I said in the opening about kind of micro efforts could have meaningful impacts. I think that really applied in El Salvador. So that's all I'll say there, and we can talk more about that later. But there were two other things that you said, Jeremy, that I kind of just wanted to pull out and would be interesting to kind of let one of the other panelists in particular talk to, Rory, because you were talking about gun violence. And I think in the UK, what we've seen is a different kind of lethal violence. And so I think that's just a connection that I want to go to if we can. So Rory, if you can kind of talk about how violence in the UK is different than in the US, and where the UK is in relation to successfully introducing some strategies to reduce violence. And then Glenn will come back to you to talk about the community piece that kind of Jeremy ended with. So
yeah, sure. I mean, I come to New York and the National Network for Safer Communities with, so I came here as a bit of an underdog, feeling like, oh my God, our criminal justice system is a pretty bad place. We don't really have any group violence interventions active. Then I heard you speak, and I suddenly feel much better about my lot. But certainly, yeah, violence in the UK, we have it, just to be very clear. The gun violence is obviously much less, largely because it is much harder to obviously get hold of a firearm in the UK. We just have fewer of them floating around. We have sort of also, I think, set quite good, clear expectations among the criminal community of what if you up it into firearms in the UK, then you do get a decent sort of sentence, as it were. And so people do reach for the much more readily accessible sort of knives, particularly. Some of them mostly being kitchen knives, but also, slightly more sort of aggressive-looking combat knives and machetes and various other bits. So it is really an issue for us of knife crime more than it is sort of gun crime. And of course, the trouble is then we find ourselves in the UK fixating on the particular weapon. So how do we stop knife crime? When, of course, the question we should be asking is how do we stop the violence? So that's something that we're sort of trying to sort of fight the good fight on. But of course, politicians have their particular sort of narratives and their particular language too. I suppose just to go back a bit as well for us. So, we published a report back in 2009 called Dying to Belong, which really did look at this issue of groups and why young people particularly join groups. And our sort of, obviously, our view was that it's partly because they're dying to belong because of issues of family breakdown, other issues of, lacking of positive male role models, lacking in educational opportunities, lacking in economic opportunities. And essentially, at that point, we sort of very much drew upon Boston, Cincinnati in particular, and Glasgow, as was back then. And then sort of almost a decade on, we're now revisiting it again because knife crime and violence has been on the rise since around 2014. The drivers of that, just to give some context to our sort of situation, I suppose, is, depending on who you speak to, some will claim that it's because of government cuts to public services that's driven this violence. Other people say it's other issues that are going on, and those issues can range everything from sort of, growth in drug markets, changes in the drugs markets, through to those sort of underlying social drivers, perhaps family breakdown and other issues. So we have sort of a real political mess, I suppose, of trying to get people onto the same page to engage with a positive solution such as a group violence intervention is actually really difficult, I think, for us at the moment. It's something we're still trying. And I guess what we see in London in particular at the moment is we have, looking at this issue of borders and violence across borders. So London, to give you an idea, it's about 8 million people. We've got a mayor of London who's responsible for policing and crime, but then beneath him we have essentially 32 local authorities. each with their own sort of equivalent, if you will, of a city council. We then have a police force that covers the whole of London too, and that's before we then get into, obviously, the different sort of community groups, the different activists, the different sort of politics of the different areas. And so when we even look at London and try, within a relatively developed economy, notwithstanding Brexit and any other sort of challenges that we have, it is really difficult for us to even think about scaling across London. And so where we have sort of reason, I suppose, to be optimistic is when we look outside London and we look at somewhere in England called Northamptonshire, a relatively small team of police officers primarily, with sort of outreach workers too, are basically doing their level best to work towards something approaching a group violence intervention. And again, like others have said, it's easy to get fixated on a particular model. It's easy to sort of say, well, you're not doing this model, you're doing that model, that's the wrong model, or so on and so on. We're just really pleased that in this particular part of England, there's a small team of people there with the backing from their local police and crime commissioner, the backing of their chief constable, and crucially too, I think, the backing of their community to make real progress. So I think for us, if anything, a lesson, and it's reinforced, I think, with some of the stories over the last day from places like New Haven, is actually big isn't necessarily beautiful in some of this space. And I think certainly we come away from our time in New York, I suspect, this week feeling like actually this is an uphill battle, one we're hopeful about, and one that certainly too we hope to help the Swedes as best we can, and sort of help use Sweden, if you will, to sort of champion activities in our own backyard. So happy to talk more in questions, but that's sort of where we're at.
Thank you. So you did my job for me. You brought it back to the community, which is where I wanted to go next, and so that's great. And I think that Minneapolis has done a really important job in thinking creatively and innovatively about how to address some of the challenges that they see between different parts of Minneapolis according to the populations that are there. So I think that that's a perfect transition to you, Glenn. So can you speak a little bit about your work with community navigators, what those populations are that we're talking about, the difference between the north side and the south side, et cetera, and what groups look like in certain areas, how they're different, how they're similar, all of that, if you would.
Okay, that's easy enough. Basically, I know people think of Minneapolis, Minnesota as like the Great White North. That's not exactly true. In our public schools, we have children who speak over 108 languages. What a lot of people don't know about Minnesota is that if there's ever a world conflict where there are refugees, Minnesota has a standing policy to accept refugees. The last big one that I can recall having some piece and part of was the Syrian conflict. We immediately, under governor's resolution, said we will accept 10 to 20,000 Syrians. Those Syrians began coming immediately. I believe right now we're at around 12,000. Those people just kind of showed up. And, hey, does anybody know anyone who speaks Syrian? Those are the type of things that we're dealing with. And it's wonderful in the fact that we, in Minneapolis, is a very, really, really, really diverse area. But also that brings those issues of community and how do we engage as an enterprise, and most importantly as a police department, because in many cases our immigrant or new arrival communities come from places where there's not a lot of trust with police, with uniforms. And so we have to double down and do double work to try to establish relationships and also help effectively police those communities in a smart way. One of the innovations that we've talked about are community navigators. Just the idea that we find someone from the community who usually has some form of social service training. Doesn't mean social worker necessarily, but understands resources and luckily speaks a language or two or three or four, who can help us better engage and also help us figure out where the gaps are. And in many cases, my navigators will step into the space where police normally are called upon. because we recognize that every time someone calls 911, it may not actually be about a law enforcement issue. It's actually a cry for help. So as good stewards and, back to policing, getting away from militaristic to swing the pendulum back to guardianship, it's understanding that part of our guardianship role is someone's asking for help. Doesn't mean there's nothing on an officer's tool belt that's going to fix that. And in many cases, officers are the worst person to send because their training and thought process is going to be, I got to fix this, it's on my tool belt, which usually means handcuffs and entrance into a system that is very hard to get out of. So my my community navigators try to step into that gap and engage with community and also help officers in many cases because there is a lack of cultural understanding. Like most places in the United States, Minneapolis Police Department, we're 882 strong, and we're probably 77% white male. That's a lot. And most of those white males do not come from the city of Minneapolis. They come from northern Minnesota, where if you have more than 4% of any minority group in their hometown, that's a huge number. I mean, it's literally hundreds of people. Many officers have told me, and like I said, I've been there 23 years, said, you're the first black person I ever talked to at length. But you're asking them to come and police a black community like North Minneapolis, which has the highest concentration of African Americans in the state. You're throwing a person into a neighborhood or a community that they have no wherewithal. Everything they learn from TV or movies, which is the worst place to learn about culture, right? And so what we're doing with the navigators is we're bringing people into the department who have no enforcement role. Their job is to assist community, but also assist officers. And what we found is that in many cases, officers are showing up on a scene. They're dealing with the problem. They're making sure it's safe, first of all. Is this safe? Hopefully, yes. And then they're calling out for the navigator, say, can I come pick you up? Can you come out? Help me understand this. And they're getting an education on the fly. And in many cases, what the navigators are doing is stepping in and saying, you don't need to be here. I got this. You can go. Which, A, takes the tension down. It de-escalates a lot of situations. But they're also offering a service from the police department that's much more malleable, much more community accepted, especially in certain cases. We were talking about an incident 2 weeks ago, a horrible incident. 2 Somali children fell out of a 5-story window. They were playing, 2 little boys. One died, one was injured, and the mother of these children did not speak English. Obviously, a 911 call goes out. A lot of officers swarm. All of them happen to be white males working that day. Go figure. You had a community that was grieving, and in many cases, they wanted to hurry up and grab these boys and start the proper process of burial. Because if anyone knows in that culture, you have 3 days. Well, I luckily got a call from a patrol commander who said, can you send your Somali community navigator here? There's people trying to pick up this kid, and I'm waiting for the medical examiner to show up, and we're going to have a riot because no one can explain in the right language that they can't pick up this child. And my navigator, by the grace of God, was literally 30 seconds away driving home. He turned around, got there, explained to the crowd in a very calm way, this is what must happen. Talked to the mother, talked to the family, and was able to get them with the medical examiner so that they could go and witness the autopsy, grieve properly, and make arrangements for a proper Islamic burial in the right time, with the medical examiner's understanding that this must be done. If it takes all night, it must be done. That was a key point for us with the community, because that's a community that if something horrific happens, we've had issues with as an enterprise, as a city enterprise. It gave us a lot of credibility in that we can understand and handle a situation. In this day and age, the same thing is happening with our Latinx communities, with being worried about if I call 911, the police are going to send me straight to immigration. We are a sanctuary city. We've declared it by statute and by mayoral proclamation. Our police department, we do not share information. We do not work with ICE at all. We actually have requested that ICE do not put police on their gear and garment. They are not police as recognized by the state of Minnesota. But that's a fight for someone else at a higher level. But just the idea that I have 2 Spanish-speaking, and I think one also speaks Portuguese, who are able to go out in community and explain the blue uniforms will not take you to ICE. They will not call ICE. If you are arrested for something, it's okay. But by the way, you can call me and I'll contact your family. I'll make sure someone's there. And, you know, we're working on creating a triage situation in the jail where if someone comes in from a non-dominant culture, we will be notified and we can go and check on them to make sure that the proper people are contacted, because in many cases, someone's picked up and no one in their family knows where they're at. And that's horrifying for someone who thinks that if, you know, dad gets picked up on Thursday, he may not get kicked loose till Monday. They think he's gone with immigration. We want to be that bridge. That's part of our role as guardians, to just get a better understanding until we get to the point where those communities work with us and understand, and we get more people who are understanding how these systems work, because in many cases, they don't know where to begin or where it ends.
Great. So thank you, Glenn. And that gave a lot of interesting transitions to get to Isael now, who not only is speaking about the Latinx community, but also when Isael and I were just in Chihuahua State in Mexico doing some work, and it's interesting to hear that police officers in Minneapolis aren't local. We were seeing that in this work as well. And then finally, just the engagement with communities. Isael, you do a different type of engagement. And so if you could speak to that, that would be great.
Okay. I wanted to speak also to the point that Jeremy made, that in Latin America, the context, it's a huge uphill battle against forces that are way beyond our reach. But there's a lot that we can do locally on the ground to make real changes. And I'll talk about that, how we see the different types of violence. In the city of San Miguel de Allende, which has like around 110,000 people, and it's in the state of Guanajuato, which is a central state, which is right now the most violent state in Mexico. So in terms of like local violence, there's a lot of various similarities between what we're seeing in the U.S. in terms of territorial gangs. Some of them are very family-oriented. There's different issues of respect. So those are conflicts that we can intervene in more easily. We actually have had some successes. We've managed some truces between 5 different gangs, and we're seeing in these neighborhoods that they're getting calmer. And so we're very encouraged by these successes in the very sort of micro level, but we're operating in a context of much greater violence. So right now in San Miguel de Allende, there's 2 cartels that are fighting. So apart from the cartel violence, maybe with the local gangs, you'll see a couple homicides every month. And now you're seeing about 3 to 4 homicides every week. And it's violence that we can't get ourselves involved with, just because these are groups that have, you know, military level weapons. These are groups that have the power to buy off police officers. These are groups that have millions and millions of dollars to hire people. And it's not that the local gang members are getting a part of that money, but they have the ability. So for us, we're sort of paralyzed in that context. Actually, recently, I work at a community center with a daycare center. And I was working in the office, and then I started hearing gunshots. And we go out, and there was an uncle who was picking up his kid from the daycare center. And the car just pulled up. 3 guys came out. They tried to kidnap him. He ran into the daycare center, and they shot him dead right in front of us. So and there's nothing you can do, you know? I mean, if I get involved in something like that, that's me, like, touching and being involved with a monster that's way beyond my control. And this is in the middle of the day. This is 2, 3 o'clock. And these guys just drive out with no problem. And so we're seeing that constantly. I mean, people are getting shot in the middle of the day, and the guys literally just walk out, so that we're not seeing any consequences. And the local government, they're just saying, oh, this is just cartel violence, we're not involved. So it plays into this narrative that, you know, these aren't innocent people. And that's what a lot of Mexican violence comes down to, you know, that they're not innocent people, that, oh, they're involved in the drug trafficking, so they deserve it. And so we don't humanize what's going on here. And I think that leads to more militarization of the conflict. I mean, the Mexican president, Calderón, in 2006, he started the war on drugs. And within 2 years, homicide rates across the country doubled. So we're seeing how this militarization of the conflict is making it much worse. And on the local end, we can't really do much. I mean, there's the weapons trafficking, there's the drug trafficking, and those are international policies that we can't really get ourselves involved with. But like Adrienne says, sometimes you don't have to fix the entire system to make significant changes. And that's what we're doing. And it's in a context that's very difficult because we can't build partnerships with the police department. I mean, even Jeremy said he was part of the question is trying to get information about the violence. And so I started asking the police department how many homicides are going on in the neighborhood I work in, because I want to know, you know, if the work we're doing is improving the situation. And somebody told me that, like, the head of public safety was, like, already asking questions like, why is this guy trying to find out how many homicides? Like, what is he involved in? So even just asking those questions puts you in a very vulnerable position. So, I mean, that's just what I want to share, that work can be done, but it's in greater context that if we don't have international changes in these policies, we're going to make some headway, but we're never going to really solve the problem.
Okay, so Rachel, I can do this to you because we worked so closely together. So I'm going to give you the difficult task of helping us tie together some of the themes that our panelists have raised and help us kind of zoom back out to the global conversation. And I know that your current work focuses a lot on urban violence, so feel free to touch on that and kind of the way that the Pathfinders are trying to have global violence in the next 10 years, if that makes sense.
Sure. So my current work focuses on violence of all forms, every type of violence. In the home, on the streets, between countries, that's what we're trying to achieve. And I want to pick up on what you just said about sort of international policy conversations and solutions, and tie it to something that I think is really worth saying, which is that the U.S. has intense, massive influence in the world. That's an obvious statement. Americans, by a vast majority, have very little idea of what is happening in the rest of the world. Our passport rates alone, right, the vast majority of Americans do not own a passport. The vast majority of Americans have not left North America. So our influence in the world is not always well understood by the constituents that vote for the politicians that create policies and programs for how we engage and interact in the rest of the world. And that leaves them to be slightly less accountable, frankly, than they should be, given the influence that we have. So I think this point about influencing the policy conversation and pushing a policy conversation that's about responsibility, that's about not heavy-handed monodora, lock everybody up, bomb communities that are giving you a hard time, bulldoze communities that are giving you a hard time, which is being done every day across the world as a solution to violence. That all has to change, and we need to be part of that conversation. And by we, I mean everyone in this room, and I mean all of us who feel like we have a responsibility to the international community. So the work that we do at the Pathfinders, which is located at the Center on International Cooperation at NYU, is to try to hold governments to account for what all member states to the United Nations agreed in 2015, which was a commitment to significantly reduce all forms of violence, right? So every single form of violence, all countries of the world committed to reducing in a significant way. Those commitments are non-binding. There's no legal mechanisms to hold countries to account. There is the use of shame. There is the use of reinforcement. There is the use of support and peer collaboration in order to get countries to live up to those commitments. And all of that is part of what we're trying to do. So we operate using the tools and the mechanisms that we have on hand to try to remind countries that they committed to this ambitious, audacious goal, which most people, and I mean experts, and I also mean the people who I see every morning when I take my dog to the park, believe it's crazy, right? And we've gone even crazier by saying that we are going to build a movement to cut in half all forms of global violence by 2030. That's insane, right? Wow. It's ambitious. It is true that when people in the early 1990s started talking about eliminating extreme poverty, the same very reaction was had. That's crazy. You're never going to eliminate extreme poverty. It's not possible. When people started talking about eliminating malaria, which is the top killer of children in Africa, this is the very same reaction. That's crazy. You're never going to eliminate it. Now we're almost at that goal. Right? So we don't expect this is going to happen overnight, but if you don't start to get really audacious with what we can achieve, then you never get there. So we have the tools, we have the knowledge, we have the commitments in the Sustainable Development Goals, and Goal 16.1, which is the reason for my title, which makes no sense, is the one that says we significantly commit to reducing all forms of violence. We have all that we need. What we lack, I think, is a few technical things, including the data, right? So a lot of countries don't even report homicide data, just basic data that we think everyone reports. A lot of countries, and it's not the countries that you think, it's Egypt, it's Jordan, right? It's countries that have the means and the money, but they're not reporting, in addition to the South Sudans and the Liberias, right? So we need the data, 100%. We also need to be more nuanced. We need to embrace one another, as Jeremy said, and stop being so fragmented in how our different communities work together. We also need to say to ourselves and to one another that if we know how to stop people from dying violently and the harm that that inflicts on communities, and we're not doing it, then we are complicit. We are negligent and we are complicit, and people are dying because we're not doing enough. And that is something that when I say that to my friends in the dog park, their ears perk up. Because all of a sudden, then they have agency. Then they think that there's something that they can do, rather than thinking, this is just part of the human condition, and there's nothing to be done about it. So I sort of would ask people here to play around with that and push that out with those that you work with, those that you know if you have dogs and you go to the dog park. Ask them what they think about that. And if they think that there's any truth to that, ask them what they can do. So that's my request.
Great. So just before we go to questions from the audience, if any of the panelists want to respond to kind of themes that were brought up here, or if you want to speak about the ways that the work that you've participated in could be contextualized or moved to other contexts, we'll open it up.
I'll just say something really briefly, and Rachel knows my shtick on this. There are, so I mentioned briefly before that statistic about the number of how the majority of the world's most violent cities are predominantly concentrated within this hemisphere. And as Rachel said, we know what works, but we have not mobilized like other kinds of grassroots efforts, like other kinds of groups have mobilized. And the example that I often reference is the C40, and I don't know how many people here are familiar with that. It started at the prompting of a former mayor of London. for mega cities around the world to coalesce around very ambitious targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It has made measurable change where national governments in a lot of cases have fallen short, and we are absolutely to blame with some of that, in fighting that fight. Why have we not mobilized similarly with cities around the world that are suffering from this kind of violence? I mean, I'm asking myself a rhetorical question. We know all the challenges, right? But if we know what works, and we know that there are common principles that bind a number of, of course not as kind of prevalent as we would ultimately like, but common principles that can bind us together. If we know that mayors and mayoral administrations often step into these roles scratching their heads wondering, what the hell do I do with this violence problem, throwing the same old tired solutions at it, if we know that we could either cut that learning curve and help break that cycle of falling into the same tired, old, failed, tough-on-crime solutions, if we know that there's something we can do about that that can help us reach some of those global goals in cutting all forms of violence in half by 2030. I mean, imagine, I did some rough back-of-the-envelope calculations. 20 of the world's most violent cities in this hemisphere, right? Well, not all of them, I mean, South Africa's up there. But anyway, take 20 of the world's most violent cities, cut their homicides in half. You can reduce, assuming that they were all in this hemisphere, the hemispheric burden of violence by 10%. 10%, and save almost as many lives as we lose in this country every single year to homicides. This really invites bold thinking, and that's why we cannot have this conversation without looking at this macro level, without really thinking big picture about what kind of movement we can actually actuate right now. And I took enough time. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess from London's perspective, I mean, it's really interesting how we found ourselves very much trapped in that cycle of, well, on the one hand, we've got enforcement, let's have more of the enforcement. And then on the other hand, we've seen a change in the language. So we do hear people talk about a public health approach. But then that is fairly sort of amorphous at the moment in the UK, I'd say. It can mean anything to anyone. And so I think what we see actually is it becomes one of those buzzwords that people put in funding applications, that put in sort of speeches, that gets put in the media, and nobody really knows what it means. And I sort of feel it's incumbent upon probably all of us here really to, as best we can, educate the politicians who ultimately are the ones that do have such a leadership role to play. And for us, certainly at the Centre for Social Justice, we're very keen to think more about how we can mobilise the community too, because I think something I was struck by yesterday and today is how that grassroots from the bottom up approach seems to work.
I just wanted to say one quick thing. I mean, Jeremy said people are throwing millions and millions into these problems without solutions, and there are solutions, and they're not that expensive. I mean, I'm paying my salary and 3 other outreach workers. I spend $45,000 a year. And that is tiny compared to like the millions that are being spent in upgrading military equipment and improving all the police departments, because we don't really have this idea that somebody in the community can also promote peace, and that also helps maintain the peace. And you're investing in the community. You're not investing in somebody that's coming from outside with new weapons, with new toys. So we really have to change that framework of the international conversation and how we're investing. Because there's a lot of money going around, but I don't see it directly in the communities.
I just amazed by this conversation. It's funny to kind of bring it back down to a city level. That's one of the things that we've learned. What you're talking about is that in our city, we're not getting any more officers. We're making a cognizant change to try to approach these issues from a different level. And one of the things that part of my role is I found grants that will help us bring in community. We believe that public safety also has to come from community. And in many cases, to go back to what David was talking about this morning with reconciliation, these type of movements need to be community-led. The police are a partner. We're not the lead horse on it. And part of my role is to find funding to help those partners to buffer up what they're trying to do because, excuse me, they're the innovators. They know their communities better than we do, and we're a piece. We're a small piece, and, you know, hopefully before I'm done, we'll be an even smaller piece, and our role will be much more focused on dealing with true incidents of, you know, service, and that a community feels safer based upon their own values and morals and not ones that we impose upon them. And I'll leave it with that.
Great. So thank you all so much. We're going to open it up to questions from the audience.
Hi. I'm a federal prosecutor in Detroit. My question is for you, Mr. Burt. I was in here yesterday, this very room, and there was a gentleman from your community who had indicated that he's having difficulty. Number one, let me ask, have you heard of ceasefire? Are you aware of what ceasefire is?
Yes, but we have GVI. We don't call it ceasefire.
Okay. Maybe it's the same thing or not, but there was a gentleman in here from your community who indicated that your mayor is not embracing the model. And maybe we can talk offline about this. But I was just going to mention to you that based on what you're hearing here, what you're seeing here, is there any way for you to go back, and I know it's a chain of command thing, but go up the chain if your mayor is not embracing it, and take that back home and get it going in Minneapolis, in St. Paul? Thank you.
Oh, okay. The mayor in St. Paul is resistant. The mayor in Minneapolis he's all aboard, and one of the conversations that we're having to take back is talk to the mayor.
Can talk to him.
Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's the mayor in St. Paul, and what we're trying to do is to get a collective of people to go and approach him. We have some pieces in place now politically that'll be able to bring it. But one of the things that we talked about it a little bit with our GVI, group violence interventions, is that what we're doing on the north side of Minneapolis, which is primarily African American, we're having to adapt for South Minneapolis, where we have much more diversity across the board. We have, East African, Somali, Native American, Laotian, Hmong. We can't use the same approach, and so we're right now trying to figure out what that looks like and how those interventions. And there's also been a public outcry for a group violence intervention for youth, and that's usually not a group that we deal with, the 17 and under. So we have to rethink that too, because that has to be a much different approach based upon the statutes and laws that we have.
Quick question. Two things. Isael, I wanted to know, and maybe this is for you in particular, but certainly all the group, is what are you doing about your own trauma? And are you doing anything? Because it's very important, that when you're on the ground, boots on the ground, seeing violence in front of you, that you realize not only you experienced direct trauma, but also vicarious trauma by listening to stories of others. That's my first question. Second question is to Rory and the rest of you. Do any of you who have outreach, do you have a support group that is weekly, ongoing, and sustained, where once you help a person out of crisis, they have an ongoing support system that helps them navigate life? Because as you said, I think you said, what did you say? The line you gave about young people dying, crying. Anyways, the bottom line is, they're crying for help, right? And so I like the line. I wrote it down, but I don't want to look for it now. So that's why I was asked two questions. One, what are you doing about your trauma? And if you haven't thought about it, you really should think about it. And the second thing is, do you have support groups, which even if you have support groups for the people you're helping, being in those support groups will help you?
Yeah, we're definitely not addressing trauma very intentionally. I think it's something we definitely have to work on. It's something I've recognized with my coworkers. I mean, they're all ex-gang members, and, we're working in neighborhoods where he's having to face gangs that have previously cut him up with machetes, and that's really tough. And We do work with a psychology program too, so I think we need to be more intentional about that. And yeah, I mean, it's something we have to work on. I think, fortunately, Mexicans have very cynical sense of humor, and so laughing it off, I think, is not a solution, but it's how we deal with it right now.
To address your question, at least with my folks and my outreach partners, we had Lisa Teasel, she's one of the co-authors of the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit, come in, and we had a day of sort of training and understanding of how it affects us in our bodies. And I'm right now working on scheduling a retreat for a lot of the outreach partners for the MPD and also community folks who I know are doing the work, who've never had any type of training in this and understanding. We're trying to have a big retreat so that we can sort of get everybody a dosage of it, and then work upon setting up those networks for those folks who are out there on the front lines all the time, because we recognize that, you know, if the healers are hurt, can they really help those who are hurting worse? And we recognize that, and even within our police department, we've been working on creating venues for the officers to kind of get some help immediately, because, you know, we know what police cynicism looks like, and we know how it shows up, and often it shows up in an officer exploding about a very minor thing in a very ugly way. And nowadays, you know, we could turn on the news and see it.
Yeah, I think that's a superb question about the trauma. Certainly from my own experience, I would say we must sort of recognise that those who are trying to help and work in those communities need to have that support. Something I certainly realised myself was that I didn't know I needed anything until I sort of finally found myself having someone else tell me that I maybe needed something. So there's also that issue of, you know, you don't necessarily know what you need. And then certainly too, what we find with particularly the young people involved in the groups and involved in the violence is obviously they are hugely affected. And even with our National Health Service, which, you know, many in the room may sort of think is this sort of universal good, actually it falls massively short on trauma and mental health. And then to the point around sort of outreach and the sort of ongoing support for people. Right. So I don't know that Northamptonshire have a weekly support group as such, but certainly they're in that first 12 months of getting going. So I think everything's up for grabs. So something I'll be happy to sort of follow up offline and then take it back to them very much. And they're keen to try and offer more of a community and family for people moving forward, so that it's not just that cliff edge end of intervention. See you later.
Hi, my name is Alex Yablon. I'm a reporter for a website called The Trace that covers gun issues. This is a question for Jeremy and Isael in particular. I've done a good deal of reporting on the relationship between like the U.S. gun industry and gun laws and violence in Mexico and Central America. And you talked about some of the obstacles to adopting more evidence-based, like less punitive means of reducing violence in those countries. I'm curious if you could talk about the role that political corruption plays in reducing, you know, does it play a role in preventing these strategies from being adopted? Do you think it contributes in itself to violence and gun violence in particular?
That's a big question. Hello? Yeah, and I really want to talk to you offline about that. I've actually followed your work on this, and I think it's extremely important. And I'm actually involved in a number of conversations to bring a roadshow that is shining a spotlight on the role of the U.S. gun market in fomenting some of the violence and instability in the region. It's tied to the massive migration issue. And this is one of my frustrations. I worked in the U.S. government on violence reduction in a region where we were completely playing at odds with our own policies that were throwing fuel on this fire. And of course, you know, being at USAID, being part of this kind of foreign assistance bureaucracy, and having very little kind of political voice in this kind of debate, it was one of the massive frustrations. in seeing the amount of money, which by any standards is a lot. I mean, I managed over $100 million a year towards this kind of work. But seeing the enormity of this problem and seeing the direction going totally off course and being powerless to even speak truth to that power, it's extremely frustrating. I have a lot to say about the ties between state corruption, about the issue of violence. I mean, even in Honduras, and you mentioned this in one of your pieces, and this is well known, U.S. guns have fallen into the hands of military forces that have brutalized their own populations. This is not news. It's probably news to a lot of Americans, that, especially the people that are, raising their hands and voting for this wall. But we are responsible for a lot of the ills in this region, and we are not really talking about it on a national level as we should be. So I have a lot more to talk to you about, but I don't want to hog the conversation.
Go ahead.
Well, I can't tell you for certain, like the corrupt politicians, like what their ties are with the drug cartels, because if I could, I probably would be in a much different situation I'm in now. But I can tell you that usually the municipal government changes every 3 years, and when there's a change in government, there's usually a change in who has ownership over the drug market. So that's when we see the high spikes in violence. So it's like every year it's like, oh, the new municipal government's coming, let's see which cartel he's in line with, and then the war starts. And then it calms down. I mean, I think most of the time when you've seen violence lower in a lot of places in Mexico is because the government has a good deal with the drug cartel and they're not fighting anymore. So, I mean, that's all I can add to the conversation.
So I just want to throw two things out. One is that in studies that have demonstrated the variables that are most likely to cause violence and recurrences of violence, corruption is consistently one of those variables without clear correlation evidence, because it's so difficult to find that, because corruption is, if done well, behind the shadows. It's hidden. It's not something that's easy to identify if it's done well, and it's not tracked very well, et cetera, et cetera. But there is a clear consistency that corruption is influential in all contexts. The other thing that I want to mention is do a plug for Rachel Kleinfeld's book called A Savage Order, where she talks, it's recently come out, it's brilliant. I think Jeremy and I disagree with some of the content of it, but she talks about privilege violence, and she talks about how violence very often is a means through which those who are in positions of power retain their positions of power, right? That's not a surprising statement to say, but very often that is done through turning the other way and allowing for corrupt systems, or fostering or facilitating corrupt systems, and that what those structures mean by security is really their own security for the elite. They do not mean security and peace for the vast portion of their population, and we buy into that by talking about security, and what that looks like is sending a lot of weapons to the military and to the police in countries around the world to protect national security. And what national security is elite protection. So all of these things are connected to one another, and I think constantly bringing up not just corruption, but also what corruption means for those who are in positions of power and abuse those who are dispossessed from power has to continue to be part of the thread of the conversation.
What's the title of your book?
A Savage Order, Rachel Kleinfeld.
Thank you, Rachel. And I think more and more today we're seeing that also in the United States. Yep. So one last question I think we have, or maybe we'll have time for two. We'll see what our timekeeper says.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for your interventions on the panel. I wanted to shift back to some references that were made to models and competition over models and interventions, and perhaps this idea of modelitis, which I think, Jeremy, you might have mentioned, and just link it to something that that Professor Kennedy said yesterday around evidence-based interventions, and he sort of problematized it for us that are they evidence-based because they're reviewed by our peers in the communities, and what does it mean to invest also in sort of the rigor that is required in expensive randomized control trials to conduct those, and then get your reactions to that in the following ways. What is your guidance or your experience or reflection on dealing with modelitis and also confronting the increasing need for evidence-based, in a rigorous way, interventions? What are your tips for navigating? And very quickly, my name is Sarah Danish, and I work in the international space with U.S. government funding, and these issues come up a lot, particularly competition around which models should be implemented overseas. So, thank you.
Thank you. And then, Chelsea, can you just get the other questions for the panelists? And then if there are conversations that go into lunch, that's totally fine with me, but I don't want to be responsible for preventing you from getting to lunch.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Rodrigo Serrano. I work at the Inter-American Development Bank. We work with governments in the region promoting policies that reduce crime and violence. And I'm here with a delegation from Brazil, from the state of Ceará, from the top officials from the Public Safety Secretariat and the police that are considering the possibility of implementing something that like focused deterrence or GBI. So I'll be very interested in hearing the reflections from, I got the understanding that there are at least 3 cases from those of you in the panel of implementing GBI. El Salvador, an attempt. I guess in Minneapolis you also have you said a GBI, and in Glasgow you mentioned in the UK. So if you could share with us a little bit of sort of some lessons that you could share with us on the implementation of or the attempts, that could be useful. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Great. And was there one more in the back there?
Yeah. I think we see with the ongoing migrant crisis in places like Syria and places like Central America and the Northern Triangle, part of that is due to climate change, and climate change exacerbating this crisis exacerbates violence around the world. So I was curious, since you guys seem to have a really incredibly broad view of violence around the globe, and also like incredibly interesting like local views of how violence happens, what plans are in place, and how have you thought about how climate change will make your work harder and will exacerbate violence around the world?
Wow. So we definitely don't have time to fully answer those 3 questions. Just to recap, we have the question about modelitis. We have the question about lessons learned in the application of group violence across contexts. And then we have the huge climate change question. So I'm just going to quickly say that we did not implement focused deterrence in El Salvador. We were evaluating the feasibility of whether that could work. And we thought that there were some positive indications that a focused deterrence approach would contribute to safety in the communities we were looking at. But we did not implement there, so keep it short. It's a publicly available document from USAID. I can send it to you if you're interested.
I'm just going to go real quick. So, Sarah, to your question about evidence, rigorous evidence, I think we have, God, this is going to be really, I hope you're not filming, a hard-on for rigorous evidence in the U.S., RCTs. I'm sorry, we really have to put that to the side in Latin America because of the cost, because of the ethical implications, and we really need to adopt a broader, more expansive definition of evidence. And I really want to put a plug for the CDC's continuum of evidence of effectiveness, which is really the framework that I subscribe to. Contextual, experiential evidence, community-based evidence. But how do you synthesize that and actually make it presented in a way that can actually be used to drive policy decisions and programmatic decisions? That's really the crux of the issue that we haven't figured out, but I just wanted to say that real quick.
And to the question of lessons learned, very quickly, do not mix gangs in the same room as call-ins. Too many fights, too much. Have them more often, and most importantly, talk to your community about what you're doing so that you get buy-in across, and you'll find out that the groups that you need to bring in will be much smaller than you probably imagine, and you'll have many more members of those groups who want out, who don't see a pathway out. In our case, we thought we would be lucky our first year if we had 5. We ended up with 137. I mean, our goal was 5, and we had 137, and I believe in the last 2 years we've lost one person, and he was in a safe house and wanted to go to a party, and he left the safe house, showed up at this party, and was killed immediately. There was not a whole lot we could do about that. But unfortunately, evidence works both ways, and it was kind of proof of the efficacy of the effort.
Well, just quickly to the evidence-based question, I feel like, it's hard to get hard evidence, but what we do community surveys where we ask people how safe do they feel, how likely they are to be robbed and assaulted in the streets. And I think we always try to use tools that give us that information, but also serve in our community work. So we're knocking door to door, we're speaking to people, we're building relationships. So I think, especially in the Latin American context, because we can't do the same kind of analysis that the U.S. can, but we can make an effort, and we should try to use a double-edged sword, use a research tool that helps build that evidence, but also helps further the work.
I think from London there's a couple lessons, because we've tried it twice before, so we're hoping now for third time lucky. But the twice before we've tried, and for various reasons, often it's not really taking the community side seriously, so viewing the community as just a tick box exercise where, well, we spoke to someone, or someone was around the table, so that's good enough, and it isn't. The other thing I think is some of the rhetoric around it, which is hard to get away from this kind of very tough on crime sounding language. And then the other issue too that we had in London was obviously putting a real time limit on something. So if you're going to pilot for 12 months a group violence intervention, well, you're not going to get very far. So that would be our sort of top 3 tips, perhaps.
So quickly, I agree with everything on the evidence. I also think we have to get away from this binary, like there's evidence or there's no evidence. We have to keep pushing that we know a lot, that we have sets of evidence, and that gets us in the door, right? And then you complicate it, and then you get into, well, we know this about this, but it's different in this. But you have to say, we have the knowledge, we have the evidence, we have the research, we have the tools, and then you get complicated once you get in the door. There are people who, if you say the opposite of that, they're not going to engage, right? So a lot of what needs to be done here is we need to get a lot more creative about how we manipulate the systems of power to get those systems to work to do what we want them to do, and not accept when they say, well, you either have evidence or you don't, so we're not going to do this. We have to get creative about manipulating those systems and push this conversation much further. On climate change, people are not talking about this nearly as much as they should. Many people would say that the single most significant contributor to the start of the Syrian conflict was the change in the environment due to climate change, water resources, etc. People aren't talking about that. It gets manipulated. You're seeing it in the Sahel. You're seeing it in our own hemisphere. It goes back to what I was saying about Americans not having sufficient knowledge about what's happening in the rest of the world. So our retreat from advances in progressive policies around climate and environment with this current government is killing people, quite literally, around the world right now. And nobody's talking about that, in large part because people just don't know, because it's not out there. It's not being discussed. So thank you for the question, and let's all keep asking it.
Great. So can we have a round of applause? And I don't want to hold you all back from lunch, which is what I think is next on the agenda.